Hi there. Tonight we step into a world of corsets, candlelight, and chamber pots. You're not in the 21st century anymore. You're standing in a velvet-carpeted hallway, the gas lamps flickering gently overhead, and somewhere nearby, a grandfather clock ticks with unhurried dignity. The year is 1882. Outside, the air smells faintly of coal smoke and horse manure, and your boots are damp from the London fog. Inside this fine townhouse, however, everything is prim, perfumed, and above all, silent. Almost too silent. You tiptoe past heavy drapes and lace doilies into a dimly lit bedroom lined with brocade and mahogany. The lady of the house, let's call her Clara, is asleep beneath a tower of quilts, her breath barely stirring the lavender, sachet pinned to her nightdress, but something calls to you from the corner of the room. There, beneath a lace cloth, is an object both feared and necessary, the chamber pot. You didn't think we'd start here, did you? But there's no use dancing around it. Tonight, we're diving bottom first into one of the great forgotten rituals of the Victorian age, the fine art of post-relief personal hygiene, or, to be blunt, how Victorian ladies wiped their behinds, without the luxury of soft, two-ply toilet paper. And here's the truth, you probably wouldn't survive this. Not the rigid etiquette, not the smell, and certainly not the idea of reusing a cloth for that. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments too. I love seeing where in the world people are tuning in from as they wind down. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin your night not on a porcelain throne, but with a decision. Do you dare brave the drafty hallway to use the outside privy, or do you stay warm and opt for the chamber pot under your bed? For Victorian women, this wasn't a hypothetical, it was nightly routine. In Clara's world, bathrooms as we know them don't exist, at least not in most homes. Some wealthy households have water closets, small rooms with rudimentary flush toilets, often unreliable and prone to freezing. But for most women, nighttime relief means the chamber pot, quietly retrieved, carefully balanced, and preferably used without making a single sound. You slide it out, a white ceramic bowl with a painted blue pattern. It's oddly dainty for something with such an indelicate purpose. Victorian aesthetics had a way of prettifying even the most private parts of life. And modesty? Modesty was everything. Even saying the word leg was frowned upon in polite company, hence those little skirts sewn onto pianos and tables. Heaven forbid someone get ideas from the exposed curve of a chair leg. And so wiping had to be equally modest. Physically, socially, even linguistically, there were no bathroom discussions over tea. Hygiene manuals, if they addressed it at all, called it personal refreshing or ladies' cleansing. Now imagine this. It's midnight, you've just relieved yourself, and you're faced with the challenge of cleaning up. There's no toilet paper roll waiting next to you. Instead, you reach into a discreet drawer in the nightstand where a folded cloth awaits. Soft flannel, reused many times, laundered weekly. It's not glamorous, but it works. You dab gently, mindful not to stain your nightdress. In some homes, these cloths are embroidered with small floral motifs, because if you must reuse a wiping rag, why not make it pretty? Historians still argue whether most middle-class women used these rags exclusively or supplemented with other methods. Some suggest that for especially delicate days, like during menstruation, moss, cotton wool, or even medicated leaves were used. A few eccentric hygiene manuals recommended lamb's wool for its softness and absorbency. Fancy? Now, if you're imagining these cloths getting tossed after a single use, think again. They're washed, usually boiled, then hung out to dry by laundresses who say nothing, but know everything. We'll meet them again later. For now, you fold the cloth neatly, place it in a lidded pail under the bed, and slide the chamber pot back into hiding. It's a strange, quiet choreography, one repeated by millions of women, night after night, in cities and country homes alike. And it's not without its hazards. More than one Victorian lady ruined a perfectly good rug by misjudging the chamber pot's position. And if you lived in a household with siblings or housemates, let's just say, boundaries were not always respected. Clara, for instance, once scolded her younger cousin for borrowing her flannel cloths during a visit. To be fair, in the dim gaslight, it was probably an honest mistake. Probably. And what of the smell, you ask? Well, you covered the pot with a lid sprinkled in a bit of lavender or carbolic powder and hoped for the best. If it got too full, you rang for the maid in the morning. If you were the maid, well, we'll get there. For now, as you settle back beneath the quilt, remember this. In the Victorian home, even your most private moments were dictated by decorum, discretion, and a complicated relationship with fabric. Tomorrow we'll step out of the bedroom and into the world of privacy rules and social rituals. For now, try not to think about where that cloth has been. You rise with the sun, its weak light slipping through the lace curtains and falling in trembling streaks across the wallpaper. The chill in the air nudges you toward the fireplace, where the coals have long since gone to sleep. Somewhere downstairs, the cook is clattering in the scullery, and soon the scent of weak tea and yesterday's toast will drift up the stairs. But you, Victorian lady of the house, or guest or cousin visiting for the season, have more pressing concerns. You need the water closet. And here begins the great unspoken ballet of bodily discretion, an art Victorians perfected to near supernatural levels. Not because they were more delicate than us, but because reputation, especially for a woman, rested precariously on how little of your physical existence intruded on anyone else's. You may breathe, you may sip, you may faint with charm, but, for heaven's sake, do not perspire, and most certainly do not admit to having needs. In polite society, bathrooms weren't discussed at all, not over dinner, not in letters, not even in close friendships. The most daring euphemisms included retiring for a moment or seeking a restorative. You'd sooner confess to spiritual malaise than mention digestion. And yet, everyone did it, even Queen Victoria herself. Imagine, the same gloved hand that signs a royal decree also, at some point, must reach for, well, something. But no one ever wrote that part down, which is why for you, the act of simply announcing your need to excuse yourself is already a delicate challenge. If you're a guest in someone's home, you wait for a pause in conversation, perhaps during a servant's discreet entrance or the repositioning of a chair. And then you quietly murmur, "I believe I shall take a moment to freshen up." That's it. No more words, no questions asked. Navigating someone else's house adds a second layer of social gymnastics. Does this household have an indoor water closet? Is it functional? If not, where is the outdoor privy, and will you be forced to walk past the gardeners? Are you expected to ring for a chambermaid, or are you meant to simply wander down the servants' hall? Of course, if you're the lady of the house, things are a little simpler, but not by much. Indoor plumbing is a rare luxury, and even when installed, it's often finicky. A surprising number of Victorian toilets were just upgraded closets fitted with high wall-mounted cisterns. Flushing involved a vigorous tug on a chain and a prayer that the pipe wasn't frozen. But let's say you're lucky. You live in a fashionable London townhouse with an indoor water closet on the first floor. You still wouldn't talk about it. You wouldn't even say the word toilet. That term, while French in origin, was considered vulgar in many English circles until well into the 20th century. Loo, necessary, lavatory, these were your safer bets. Historians still argue whether this rigid avoidance of bathroom language was primarily about modesty or class distinction. Some suggest it was about maintaining illusions. The wealthier you were, the more you could pretend your body didn't have such functions at all. Meanwhile, there were rules about everything else too. How loudly you could walk, how tightly your corset could be laced, and how often you were expected to change your linen underthing. And that naturally included how and when you handled your most human tasks. Even in literature, this absence is deafening. Jane Austen never mentioned chamber pots. Dickens alluded to privies only as plot devices for poor characters. In fact, the only time bodily functions really show up in Victorian writing is when they're being punished, like the great moral panic over self-abuse, which, as one doctor delicately phrased it, could lead to fatal moral and physical deterioration, general debility, and madness, all for touching yourself. But wiping, not a word, not even in the copious medical texts. One could write pages on leeches and bloodletting, but wiping was apparently beneath mention, literally and socially. Yet behind the closed doors, life went on. Servants emptied chamber pots. Families quietly restocked the rag supply. And Victorian women navigated all of this with a stoic elegance that almost defied reality. Imagine wearing 6 layers of skirts, drawers that tied at the waist and nowhere else, and a cage crinoline just to visit a drafty outhouse with no lock. And yes, crinolines. Let's pause on those. These voluminous, cage-like structures, worn under dresses to puff out the skirts, were often wider than doorways, which meant using any kind of narrow toilet, indoor or outdoor, was a logistical nightmare. One wrong angle and your petticoats could end up in the bowl, or worse, someone else's bowl. There's an actual recorded case from 1858 of a woman in Manchester whose crinoline caught on a fence post while she was relieving herself in a field. She toppled backward into a muddy ditch, tangled like a moth, in a lampshade. Thankfully, she survived with nothing but wounded pride and several pages in the local paper. But mostly, these things happened silently, discreetly, and without documentation. The real daily lives of Victorian women were hidden under lace, linen, and layers of unspoken routine. So the next time you think about complaining that someone used the last square of toilet paper, remember Clara, elegant, exhausted, and holding a reused cloth in the half-light of morning. She never complained. She just folded, rinsed, and powdered her nose. You adjust your skirts, check your hair, and glide back into the parlour as if you'd merely been reading poetry in a sunlit corner. Because, in the Victorian era, the only thing worse than having a body was reminding anyone else that you had one. You might think, modern as you are, that something as fundamental as toilet paper would have made its way into the lives of Victorian ladies. After all, the printing press had been around for centuries. Paper was everywhere. Books, letters, advertisements, theatre playbills fluttering through the streets. Surely someone thought to dedicate a little of that pulp to more personal applications. Well, someone did. But not in time for Clara. The truth is, Victorian England met toilet paper with a curious blend of suspicion, disinterest, and outright snobbery. It wasn't that no one had invented it. They had. In fact, Joseph Gaiety, an enterprising man in America, had released medicated paper for toilet use all the way back in 1857. He printed his name on every single sheet, perhaps the only time branding has felt deeply personal and deeply unfortunate. But across the pond, the British elite scoffed. Why buy paper to throw it away? Wasteful, uncivilized, positively American, and so you, Clara, or someone very much like her, simply wouldn't have considered it. Not seriously. Toilet paper, as we know it, was expensive, scratchy, and smelled faintly of pharmaceutical ambition. And even when it did begin to creep into British households in the 1880s and 90s, it came not as a roll, but in stiff, folded sheets stacked in a box. Think tracing paper with a superiority complex. Not exactly cloud soft. Historians still argue whether the reluctance to embrace toilet paper stemmed more from class disdain or practical frugality. Some point to the Victorian obsession with thrift, others to the equally Victorian obsession with pretending that wiping simply didn't happen. But happen it did. So what did they use instead? Well, for many, the answer was already close at hand rags. But rags had their limits. In homes without regular laundry staff, or for particularly busy mornings, Victorian ladies turned to the printed word. Yes, paper was used, just not the kind sold in apothecaries or novelty shops. Instead, people repurposed what was already lying around: newspapers, catalogues, pages from books, and the occasional personal letter. Some even stapled together worn-out almanacs or calendars for easy hanging near the privy. If you're picturing someone wiping with Dickens, you're not entirely wrong. In fact, the Sears Roebuck catalogue, though American, would later become infamous for its secondary use in outhouses. In Britain, the Bristol Gazette, local broadsheets, and defunct etiquette manuals all found themselves in service of the rear. Of course, this was not without consequence. Ink rubbed off, paper scratched. Some pages were simply too stiff or glossy to fold, leading to what one old diary refers to delicately as a most distressing incident in the garden shed. You chuckle, but for Clara it was a real concern. She might keep a basket under the bed or next to the chamber pot, filled with folded squares of soft newsprint. Perhaps she tore them in quiet moments after dinner. Perhaps the maid did it for her. Either way, it wasn't polite to acknowledge. Now, if you were particularly wealthy, you might have access to a boudoir book, a dainty, lace-trimmed notepad, specifically designed to tear into squares for private use. Some were even perfumed. The ultimate in Victorian luxury, wiping discreetly and smelling faintly of rosewater while you did it. But these were rare. For the average upper-class woman, old letters, bills, or even grocery receipts did the trick. Imagine wiping with your husband's bank statement, a small rebellion perhaps. Still, there was a risk of cuts, of ink stains, of the sheer indignity of it all. And yet this was life, and let's not forget the humble leaf. That's right. If you were outdoors, perhaps on a country picnic, or at your summer estate in Dorset, nature provided. Broadleaves, dried grasses, even flower petals might stand in for paper. Some hygiene manuals from the time recommend mullein leaves, which were known for their velvety texture and mild antiseptic properties. Others suggest lamb's ear, not the animal, mind you, but the fuzzy silver plant you'd find growing near hedgerows. Of course, identifying the wrong leaf could be unfortunate. There are at least 2 recorded cases of Victorian women mistaking nettle for something more forgiving. The results? Itchy, welted behinds and silence. Always silence, you might ask. Wasn't there a better way? Yes, but better was often expensive, French or both. Still, even in the homes that dabbled in toilet paper, it wasn't glamorous. It arrived in stiff packets or tins and bore names like Bronco or Izal, brands that sound more like furniture polish than hygiene products. The paper itself was non-absorbent, squeaky and occasionally waxed, the kind of thing that sounds better in theory than in practice. Even late into the Victorian period, many homes continued using cloth or repurposed paper. Toilet paper, though invented, had not yet triumphed. So you, Clara, still fold your newspaper squares with quiet precision. Maybe you read a headline as you do. Maybe you roll your eyes at the editor's opinion. Maybe you save the society. Pages for last, you dab, you fold, you tuck it away. And somewhere in a dusty archive, a historian frowns at the absence of records, wondering why Victorian women left so few traces of their most private habits. Maybe it's because they were too busy wiping with them. You're beginning to notice a pattern, aren't you? For all the embroidered petticoats, calling cards and fainting couches, life in the Victorian era was shockingly hands-on, especially when it came to things no one talked about. Take, for example, the humble rag. In the absence of paper, either because it was too expensive, too rough, or simply unavailable, most Victorian ladies turned to cloth. Not the fine silk of their gloves, mind you, but soft flannel, worn muslin, or old linen torn into strips. These were affectionately, though never publicly, known as toilet cloths, and they were a staple of any well-organized household. They weren't sold in shops. You didn't register for them at your wedding. They were made quietly from old nightgowns, discarded underpinnings, or threadbare napkins. No one admitted to owning them, yet every woman had a drawer tucked away just for them. You reach into yours now. The fabric is soft, worn smooth by countless uses and washes. You know exactly which ones are the most absorbent, which are past their prime, and which have become suspiciously stiff. Historians still argue whether these cloths were always washed with lye soap or simply boiled and sun-dried. Some claim they were rinsed in vinegar to cut the smell. Others suggest that in larger households they were simply thrown in with the underclothes and scrubbed until memories faded. But there's one thing everyone agrees on. Someone had to wash them, and that someone, more often than not, was a laundress. She's the unseen hand in this whole story, the one who handles the aftermath of modesty. She works in the scullery, hands red from lye, arms sore from wringing. She never comments on what she scrubs clean, only notes, silently, who uses too many cloths, who stains more than usual, and who might be visiting from out of town. Because yes, there's information to be found in laundry. No wonder some laundresses were rumoured to be the best-informed women in the neighbourhood. They knew things before the doctor did. For you, the lady of the house, there's a trust there, unspoken, essential, and delicately layered with class division. You rely on her discretion as much as you rely on her skills. When you fold your used cloth and place it in the covered tin beside the chamber pot, you know she'll empty it in the morning. She'll boil them in a giant copper kettle, hang them to dry behind the kitchen, and fold them back into the linen drawer without a word. It's a quiet system. Efficient, but a bit circular. Cloth wipes weren't just a nighttime solution. During the day, especially if you were at home and not expecting company, they might be your go-to. Stored in a side drawer in the water closet or tucked inside a lace-covered box, they offered a softness you couldn't find in crinkly paper or rough leaves. And yes, sometimes they were shared. In large families, the cloths might be rinsed between uses but not fully washed until evening. The idea of personal hygiene was very different in the 1800s. Germ theory was still gaining ground, and most people believed disease came from bad smells, not invisible microbes. So if it didn't smell, it was probably fine. You raise an eyebrow, so would Clara. But this was normal, of course. There were hazards. Rags had to be stored carefully, especially in hot weather. Left in a tin too long, they could mold. Left open to the air, they could embarrass you in front of guests. And heaven help the unlucky soul who confused the clean stack with the soiled one. One family journal, rare, handwritten and tucked away in a Dorset attic, tells the story of Aunt Miriam, who mistook a bundle of used cloths for her embroidery, scraps. The resulting tea cosy was burned in the garden without ceremony, but most of the time the system worked. Like a whispered agreement between generations of women, we don't talk about it, but we do it right. Cloth wasn't just for wiping either. During menstruation, many women used larger, layered flannel cloths tucked into their drawers. Primitive. Pads held in place with ribbons or safety pins, these too were washed and reused. The same laundry routines, the same unspoken knowledge. There were even small touches of care. Some women embroidered tiny initials onto their cloths, not out of pride, but to prevent mix-ups. Others scented them with rosewater or lavender before storage. A few fastidious households had guest cloth, a concept that sounds both generous and horrifying. Still, the cloths tell us something important, that cleanliness, for all its taboos, mattered deeply, even when it meant handling the process yourself, even when it meant trusting a servant, even when it meant never mentioning it again. Because in Victorian England, dignity didn't mean perfection, it meant privacy, and that privacy extended to disposal. Some households had dedicated slop pails, often lidded, where soiled cloths were placed until laundering. Others used covered baskets lined with waxed paper. Whatever the method, the goal was the same. Keep the act invisible, and so once again you wipe, fold, and place the cloth in its container. You pull the lace doily back over the pot. You adjust your skirts. You step into the hallway. No one ever saw you wipe. No one ever will. The hallway is cold beneath your slippers, and the wallpaper hums faintly with damp. As you make your way toward the drawing room, your thoughts linger, not on the flickering hearth or the embroidery waiting by the window, but on that small porcelain pot beneath your bed and the quiet fabric folded neatly within its lidded pail. Because that's the truth of it, isn't it? Behind every silk ribbon and polished shoe lies a hidden system of unspoken, unglamorous routine. And tonight we turn toward perhaps the most iconic, yet underappreciated, artifact of Victorian hygiene, the chamber pot. No flushing, no plumbing, no convenient buttons, just a bowl, a delicately painted, gloriously fragile bowl that sat under beds, inside washstands, or tucked behind modesty screens like a naughty secret. And yet it was as essential as your corset or parasol. You see, the indoor toilet, even in its earliest, clunkiest form, was a rarity. In 1851, when millions visited the Great Exhibition in London's Crystal Palace, many were stunned by the display of water closets with actual flushing mechanisms. For some, it was the first time they'd ever seen such a device. Historians still argue whether this was a turning point for sanitation in Britain or just a short-lived novelty for the wealthy. Either way, you, Clara, are not one of the few with a flushable throne. You're one of the many with a pot and a process. In the quiet of night, using a chamber pot required stealth, balance, and no small degree of knee control. Most women wore split-crotch drawers open at the center to allow them to squat over the pot without fully undressing. It sounds odd now, but it was a genius bit of design that let you maintain modesty, layers, and warmth. Still, it wasn't foolproof. There are accounts, hushed, journaled, rarely published, of women slipping, tipping, or misjudging. One particularly vivid diary entry from a Norwich housekeeper tells of her mistress's chamber pot cracking like thunder beneath her during a restless night. The poor woman insisted it was a manufacturing flaw. The housekeeper was not convinced, and then, of course, there's the matter of transport. Once used, the pot couldn't simply be left to stew until morning, especially in households with early risers or guests. That's where the maid, or in larger homes, the maid of all work, came in. Her job? To rise before dawn, enter bedrooms without waking the occupants, and carry the full pot down to the scullery. There it was emptied, usually into a slop sink, a wide, deep basin designed for precisely this sort of indignity. Afterward, the pot was rinsed, wiped dry, and returned to its hiding spot, ready to repeat its nightly vigil. The chamber pot had many nicknames: Thundermug, Jerry, the Gazunder, because it goes under the bed. But no matter what you called it, everyone relied on it. From duchesses to dairymaids, it was the great equalizer, and it wasn't always confined to the bedroom. In country homes or during long evenings in chilly parlours, some women kept portable pots beneath wide skirts. Yes, really, a special kind of commode chair, padded, upholstered, and built to conceal its function, could be discreetly used mid-conversation. You'd sit, chat politely, then quietly excuse yourself for a restorative while a maid whisked away the contents. It sounds absurd, but consider this. Outdoor privies were often a long, cold walk. Indoor ones, if they existed, were shared among many. And for a woman in full formal dress, complete with whaleboned corset and layers of petticoats, going to the loo was not a quick errand, it was a 20-minute expedition. So instead, you stay seated, you shift just slightly, and you pretend the gentle clink beneath you was merely the fire settling. Some designs even came with aromatic compartments, small sections filled with dried lavender or pressed herbs, meant to mask odours. Others were built into vanity cabinets or ottomans, ensuring that form always accompanied function, even if it meant sitting on your own secrets. Yet for all their ingenuity, chamber pots came with clear limitations. There were no wipes built in, no roll of paper neatly perched beside, which meant, once again, that cloth rags or folded paper had to be placed nearby in advance, often hidden in small boxes or embroidered pouches. You'd never leave them visible, not even to family. One surviving artifact from a Yorkshire estate includes a velvet-lined drawer labelled only personal items. Inside were cloth wipes, neatly folded and monogrammed. Also inside, a small silver bell for calling the maid. Because wiping, in Victorian England, was not just a private act. It was a choreographed event, and like all good performances, it required set design, costume, and the occasional stagehand. Now imagine doing all of this while visiting someone else's home. You're a guest for the week. You're given the blue room with its fine tapestries and dreadful draught. At night, you climb into a high feather bed and pretend you don't need the pot beneath. But when nature calls, you creep out, grateful for the chamber stick beside you, and do your business as delicately as possible. Then comes the wiping, and the folding, and the dreadful moment when you realize there's no bell. Do you carry the pot yourself? Do you sneak into the hallway, clutching your shame in a porcelain bowl? One enterprising debutante in Bath allegedly disguised her chamber pot inside a hat box for transport. Whether the hat survived is unknown, and yet, somehow, you always manage, because dignity is not about ease. It's about pretending there is no difficulty at all. You replace the pot beneath the bed, you fold the cloth into its pouch, you take a breath, and you emerge composed, perfumed and radiant, because the secret of the Victorian lady was not that she didn't wipe, it's that no one ever saw her do it. You might think we've covered it all by now: cloths, rags, and a chamber pot choreography that would rival any royal court dance. But just when you believe the Victorian hygiene toolkit couldn't surprise you any further, it's time to discuss an object equal parts humble and haunting: the sponge on a stick. Yes, dear listener, a sea sponge affixed to a handle, sometimes of ivory, sometimes of wood, occasionally of something far less dignified, was for centuries a standard method of rear-end cleansing. And though its legacy reaches back to ancient Roman latrines, This curious implement was not entirely absent from the Victorian world, especially in places where water was more readily available than paper, and modesty could be set aside in favour of function. Let's take a little trip. It's 1874. You're aboard a luxury passenger ship crossing the English Channel. The accommodations are elegant, silver service in the dining saloon, rosewood panelling in the staterooms, and yes, shared bathroom facilities that come with the sea's own secret weapon, the sponge stick. Sea voyages, you see, offered a rare paradox. On land, you might guard your hygiene secrets with your life, but at sea, practicality often trumped pretense, especially when one shared a privy with half the first-class cabin. So there, nestled in the ship's water closet, between the pitcher of fresh water and a bar of medicinal soap, you might spot a curious bucket filled with salty rinse water and a sponge stick bobbing like a rubber duck with responsibilities. You grip the handle, raise the sponge, and, let's just say, you do what must be done. Now, before you gag on behalf of history, know this. The sponge stick was often rinsed between uses, soaked in vinegar or alcohol solutions, and sometimes scented with camphor or lavender. Did this fully sterilize it? Absolutely not. Did it make users feel better about the whole experience? Almost certainly. Historians still argue whether sponge sticks were commonly used in English households or mostly confined to hospitals, ships, and military barracks. Some evidence suggests that wealthier homes, particularly those influenced by continental habits, may have kept them in water closets, especially where bidets weren't an option. But the practice was never widely advertised. For good reason, still their practicality made them difficult to abandon entirely. In fact, one surviving catalogue from a Victorian apothecary lists hygienic cleansing rods alongside enema syringes and nose flutes, proof that the Victorians, despite their silence, did indeed acknowledge their rears from time to time, quietly. Let's pause here to appreciate the level of discretion this era demanded. You might have a sponge on a stick, but never display it openly. It would likely be kept behind a screen or tucked away in a lidded urn beside the basin. Heaven forbid a guest walk in and mistake it for a decorative item, which, given some of the household decor at the time, was a real possibility. A mahogany handle and floral sponge might have passed for a parlour accent piece. Still, sponge use wasn't limited to the rear end. In fact, full-body sponge baths were a cornerstone of Victorian hygiene, particularly for women confined by illness, confinement, or corsetry. A seated wash with warm water, lavender soap, and a sponge gently wrung over the skin could be both cleansing and emotionally restorative, particularly when it was the only bathing option available for weeks on end. Which brings us to another sponge-adjacent habit, the bidet workaround. Since bidets were largely a French import and not widely embraced by English sensibilities, Victorian women in Britain sometimes created makeshift cleansing bowls in the privacy of their dressing rooms. A shallow basin, a jug of warm water, a sponge or cloth, and absolute solitude were all they needed to perform what hygiene manuals called intimate ablution. There's even some whispered evidence of women using tea infusions, such as chamomile or calendula, in their cleansing water, claiming it reduced irritation and added a faintly floral scent. Whether it worked or not, the mental image of a woman crouched over a bowl of warm tea is, well, gently absurd. One journal from 1886 recounts the peculiar habits of a noblewoman who travelled with her own cleansing implements, sponge, folding basin, and all, wrapped in a velvet pouch and discreetly labelled art supplies. Now that's Victorian creativity at its peak. But what about when none of this was available? Let's say you were traveling light, visiting a cousin in the country perhaps, or stuck waiting for a carriage at a coaching inn. There, in the outhouse, you might find nothing but a rough bench, a hole, and a bucket of cold water. And in that bucket, floating like an unspoken punchline, the community sponge. Don't worry, no one liked it then either. Most women preferred to avoid using anything communal. They might carry a personal cloth in their reticule or keep a square of muslin tucked in their sleeve, just in case. But the sponge remained for many a reluctant fallback, especially when water was present, but privacy was not. In fact, several surviving hygiene pamphlets from the 1890s begin their ladies section with this very advice: it is always prudent to carry one's own cloth, not exactly embroidered on a sampler, but a sentiment widely shared. And so, the sponge stick lingers in the shadows of history. An oddity, a solution, a source of quiet dread. It reminds us that even in an era obsessed with discretion and dainty decorum, the human body still required the occasional scrub. Or, as one apothecary brochure put it, a refreshing cleanse for delicate regions. Subtle. You return the sponge to its bucket. You rinse your hands. You fluff your skirts. No one will ever speak of this again, but that sponge, it knows things. You're strolling now, not through the tiled halls of a city townhouse, but along a worn stone path in the countryside. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke and cow dung, and the sounds of clattering pans and a creaky cartwheel drift from a nearby cottage. Welcome to the other half of Victorian England. Here, the lace-trimmed cloths and perfumed sponge sticks are not only rare, they're almost laughable. Because when it comes to wiping in the working-class Victorian world, the choices are, let's call them rustic. Let's imagine you're a farmer's wife or the teenage daughter of a blacksmith. Your home is 1 or 2 rooms shared with siblings, chickens, and the occasional curious goat. You have a privy, maybe. It's a wooden shed with a pit dug below, and on most days the seat is too cold to sit on and too splintery to forget. If it's raining, you put it off. If it's snowing, you hold it in and wiping. It's all about availability. No linen rags. No imported papers. No sponge sticks with engraved handles. Just what's within reach. Leaves, straw, corn husks, and if you're lucky, yesterday's newspaper, assuming your father hasn't used it to line his boots. Some homes, especially near cities, kept a toilet brick, a hollow clay or wooden box filled with sand or crushed stone meant for scraping rather than wiping. Others simply used their bare hands, followed by a wash in cold, soapy water from the communal bucket. It was a system. Not a pleasant one, not a polite one, but a practiced, unflinching routine. Historians still argue whether such practices were common across all of working-class England or varied regionally. Some Victorian reformers, horrified by the state of rural hygiene, claimed poor families didn't even wipe at all, though this, like many moral panics of the age, was likely exaggerated by class prejudice. Still, evidence suggests wiping with whatever was handy was, quite simply, the norm. Catalogues, pamphlets, and scrap paper found second lives in the outhouse. A popular item, used envelopes, particularly the kind with soft, fibrous paper and no glue. One humorous memoir from Yorkshire recalls a grandmother who saved every letter ever received, not for sentiment, but for the quiet comfort of knowing they'd always be useful. Then there was moss, soft, absorbent, and often found growing near water troughs or under shady hedgerows. Some families collected and dried it in the summer for use year-round. Sphagnum moss, in particular, had mild antiseptic properties which later made it popular in field hospitals during World War I, but in Victorian outhouses it was simply green gold. For families living near the sea, kelp blades, dried seaweed, and yes, the occasional fish skin made appearances. Not because they were preferred, but because they were free. Rough, one memoir admits, but better than snow. Snow, however, was indeed used, especially in mountainous regions during winter when leaves were buried and cloth was too precious to soil. You'd crouch behind a shed, grab a handful of powder, and hope the frostbite wouldn't linger. It's a stark contrast, isn't it? While Clara in her townhouse quietly folds monogrammed flannel, the shepherd's wife in Derbyshire reaches for a handful of dry hay and doesn't blink. Two Englands coexisting, both wiping, neither admitting it. And that's perhaps the most unifying trait, the silence. Whether you had a maid or a moss bundle, no one talked about wiping. Not at church, not at the pub, not even over wash days when the entire neighbourhood could see your underthings flapping in the wind. You might share stories about scalding your hands or misplacing your soap, but the details of what went on behind the privy door, locked down tighter than the gin cupboard on Sunday. There were exceptions, of course. A few brave reformers tried to bring hygiene into public discourse, usually men with pamphlets and very strong opinions. One 1880s booklet, distributed by a well-meaning clergyman, urged mothers to teach their daughters the gentle arts of washing below the belt. Another recommended feminine ablutions with carbolic acid once daily, which likely resulted in more than a few unfortunate stings. But even when well-intentioned, these guides were rarely welcomed. Too invasive, too frank, and let's be honest, few could afford the soaps and basins they recommended anyway. So traditions continued. Cloths if you had them, paper if you could spare it, leaves, moss, or hay when you had nothing else. And among the poor there was a kind of wry humour about it. One Sheffield miner reportedly joked that his backside had read more literature than his eyes. Another, when offered store-bought toilet paper by a travelling merchant, sniffed and said, "Feels like what we wipe with already." Still, change was coming. Slowly. Privies were improved, health campaigns crept into schools, and charitable efforts began distributing hygiene supplies to struggling households. But even in this age of candles and corsets, toilet paper remained an absurd luxury. So, tonight, as you nestle under your covers, maybe with flannel pajamas and a soft pillow, spare a thought for the girl in the thatched cottage, squatting beside a frost-covered bucket with a dried corn husk in one hand and a sigh in her chest. She didn't have much, but she did what needed doing, and she never complained. Let's say you're feeling fancy. You've inherited a bit of money from a distant aunt, bless her, and now, thanks to a series of socially acceptable coincidences, you find yourself in possession of a modest but respectable townhouse in Bath. Not grand enough for high society, but just polished enough to start making some upgrades. Among them, a mysterious new fixture from the continent. It's French, it's porcelain, and no one is entirely sure how to talk about it without whispering, "Yes, we've reached the bidet." Now, the bidet wasn't invented in the Victorian era. It had existed in France since the late 17th century, originating in the boudoir of the aristocracy, where, much like powdered wigs and tiny dogs, it became a mark of refinement. But it was not widely embraced in Britain, at least not publicly. To the average Victorian lady, the bidet was foreign, suspiciously intimate, and dare we say, unladylike. Because while a chamber pot was a grim necessity, a bidet implied that you acknowledged the existence of your nether regions. With water. On purpose. And in a seated position. Scandalous. Still some brave souls gave it a go. You, Clara, are one of them. After all, you've read about its benefits in a translated French hygiene manual, well hidden in your bedside drawer under a copy of Lady Audley's Secret. You've even whispered with your cousin Eugenie, who spent a summer in Paris and returned looking suspiciously refreshed. So you make your move. You order a bidet discreetly and install it in your dressing room. It arrives via crate labelled gardenware and is installed by a plumber who promises with an arched brow that no one need know. The bidet sits low to the ground, with a wide open bowl and a curved basin meant to be straddled. There are no jets, no heated seats, just porcelain, a pitcher of warm water and a sponge or cloth nearby. You must crouch, balance, pour, and pat dry, all without knocking over the perfume bottles or alerting the maid, and it's not terrible. In fact, it's remarkably refreshing, especially after a long carriage ride or a particularly humid summer evening. The water soothes, the sponge works, the towel is soft. For once, hygiene feels a little like self-care, not penance. Historians still argue whether the bidet ever achieved real popularity in Victorian Britain. Some say it remained a niche luxury found only in Anglo-French homes or among the scandalously forward-thinking. Others point to scattered references in shipping manifests and plumbing ledgers that suggest its quiet presence in more households than we thought. But culturally, it never caught on the way it did in France or Italy. Why? Well, a few reasons. First, plumbing. Bidets required access to running water and decent drainage, luxuries still lacking in many British homes, even upper-class ones. Installing a bidet often meant sacrificing space, making it more common in city homes than rural estates. Second, reputation. Anything associated with French sensuality, however innocent, carried social risk. The bidet was often linked, rightly or wrongly, to ladies of the evening. One popular joke of the 1870s went, "She keeps a bidet, and not for her horse." Enough said. And third, British modesty. The same cultural instincts that led to covering piano legs also made the idea of intimate washing difficult to digest. Better to dab with a cloth and pretend nothing ever happened. Still, the bidet endured, quietly, in bedrooms, in dressing rooms, occasionally in seaside hotels run by French émigrés who couldn't quite abandon their plumbing traditions, and, for women like you, curious, open-minded and willing to straddle ceramic for comfort's sake, it was a revelation. That's not to say there weren't missteps. Pour the water too quickly and it splashes, sit too far back and the sponge falls in. One diary entry from a rather harried governess describes slipping off a bidet entirely, causing a domino effect of toppling toiletry bottles, shattered porcelain, and a near miss with a candle. She referred to it modestly as an aquatic misadventure of French design. Yet, even with its quirks, the bidet found quiet fans. In fact, some bidets were customized. A few were fitted into vanity cabinets, complete with lidded tops and matching upholstery. Others came with warming trays, small, compartments filled with hot coals or heated stones to keep the water from chilling. And in at least one recorded case, a bidet was hidden inside a carved oak chest, disguised as a writing desk. Just imagine the confusion during letter hour. And what of the towels? Bidet users often kept a stack of linen cloths specifically for patting dry. These were smaller than standard towels and changed daily, sometimes more than once, depending on frequency. A good bidet towel was soft, durable, and ideally monogrammed, because if you were going to wash your undercarriage with grace, you might as well do it in style. Of course, not all households welcomed the bidet. Some husbands found it distasteful, some servants whispered about it, some friends, upon discovering one in your room, might raise an eyebrow and then never return for tea. But for you, it's a quiet act of rebellion, a splashy little secret, a porcelain confession that beneath the starch and society, you are a woman with a body, and sometimes that body deserves a rinse. You towel off, you close the lid, you straighten the lace trim on the vanity and adjust your skirts. No one needs to know, but you know, and the bidet, it never tells. Back in your sitting room now, teacup in hand, you enjoy a rare moment of peace. The fire crackles softly. A clock ticks somewhere behind you. And the latest issue of The Lady's Companion rests unopened in your lap, mostly because you're still thinking about your porcelain secret in the dressing room. You've embraced the chamber pot. You've dared to explore the bidet. You've even made peace with the flannel rag system. But now, in the flickering glow of Victorian domesticity, a new anxiety creeps in. Are you wiping wrong? Enter the great wave of medical warnings and moral panics that gripped Victorian England like a corset too tight. Because just as the 19th century began to discover hygiene, it also began to fear it. Not cleanliness itself, mind you, but the manner of achieving it. A sudden flood of medical journals, etiquette books and pamphlets, some by doctors, many by enthusiastic amateurs, began to warn women about the dangers of improper cleansing. Chief among them, hysteria, nervous collapse and moral decline. Yes, all that from wiping. You may roll your eyes, but Clara, Our Lady of the Hour, would have been told, perhaps by her doctor or her mother or a visiting aunt, that overstimulation during cleansing could awaken unladylike desires. A well-placed sponge or vigorous cloth could, in the wrong hands, or the right ones, depending on your perspective, become a one-way ticket to ruin. Historians still argue whether these fears were based more on science or social control. Probably both. The era's limited understanding of female anatomy, combined with its deep fear of feminine autonomy, led to bizarre theories that wiping front to back could provoke excitability, or that washing too often might damage the womb. The uterus, according to some, was considered a migratory organ, prone to drifting about the body if disturbed. No, really. One medical text from 1871 warned against friction of the tender regions, which could dislodge the humours and awaken unnatural appetites. Another suggested that women who engaged in daily application of water below the navel might become listless, melancholic, or unfit for marriage. And so wiping became a fraught experience. 2. Rough and you risked injury. Too gentle and you weren't clean. Too frequent and you were suspicious. Too infrequent and you were unhygienic. It was a razor-thin tightrope balance between propriety and impropriety, illness and wellness, invisibility and judgment. Naturally, this confusion created a booming market for products. Feminine sponges, ladies' lotions, and medicated cloths began to appear in advertisements, each promising to purify without provoking, to cleanse without consequence. These were sold in chemist shops tucked discreetly in brown paper and often labelled with euphemisms like personal refreshment or harmony sachets. Some came with handwritten instructions on how to avoid overstimulation, which, frankly, sounds like a challenge more than a warning. Of course, the reality behind these products was often less glamorous. Many were soaked in borax, camphor, or even phenol, ingredients that would make modern dermatologists scream into a lace handkerchief. But they were what women had, and they used them carefully. In boarding schools, young girls were taught not just how to cleanse, but when, how often, and with what expression on their face. No joy, one schoolmistress famously wrote, no dallying, Wipe briskly and without distraction, which might be the least sexy hygiene advice ever given. And then there were the home remedies, recipes passed down from mother to daughter. Rosewater with alum, vinegar and honey, even boiled milk cooled and applied with cotton. Some swore by chamomile, others by crushed mint leaves. One particularly eccentric entry in a domestic diary recommends wiping with a cloth soaked in tea and gin, which, if nothing else, guaranteed a more cheerful experience. But behind the lace curtains and brass basins, the truth was simpler. Women were trying to feel clean, stay modest, and avoid scandal. Not an easy trifecta. You, Clara, have likely tried several methods. You've dabbed with rose-scented cloths. You've experimented with French lotion that burned more than it soothed. You've even whispered to your closest friend about a tingling sensation that left you both giggling and alarmed, and through it all, you've done what every Victorian lady did, kept a straight face, because admitting discomfort or curiosity or, heaven forbid, pleasure could bring unwanted attention. Better to feign ignorance than to risk being called nervous, willful, or the worst label of all, hysterical. Let's not forget, that hysteria wasn't just a term, it was a diagnosis, and it was disturbingly common. Women who deviated from behavioral norms could be prescribed everything from rest cures to cold baths to, yes, pelvic massage administered by a physician. In some clinics, this was considered a medical treatment, not an afternoon delight, so the very act of cleaning oneself became tangled in a web of medicine, morality, and misunderstanding. And through it all, you wiped. Carefully, discreetly, perhaps with a twinge of guilt, perhaps with a private grin. You close your copy of The Lady's Companion. You sip your tea. You remind yourself once again to refill your personal cloth drawer before the laundress comes by. And somewhere in the distance, a doctor in a waistcoat frowns over a case of excessive freshness. You'll manage. You always do, because for the Victorian lady, the real talent wasn't knowing how to wipe, it was knowing how to never, ever talk about it. Let's slip behind the stairs now, past the velvet curtains, and away from the parlour music, and descend into the quiet, damp corners of the house where elegance and propriety give way to steam, suds, and secrets. Welcome to the world of the laundress. She is in many ways the unsung hero of Victorian domestic life. Without her, the teacups might sparkle and the silver may gleam, but the truth of the household, the messy, earthy, very human truth, would begin to smell rather quickly. And few truths were more unavoidable than the pile of soiled toilet cloths, waiting to be laundered at week's end. You might imagine a maid delicately carrying away Clara's folded flannels in a silver tray, like an offering. In reality, it was far more practical and pungent. The cloths, wrapped in waxed paper, bundled in canvas bags, or tossed straight into the soil bucket, would be whisked off to the scullery or an outbuilding, often at dawn, and dumped into a basin of cold water to soak before the day's wash began. Laundresses didn't flinch. Not at bloodstains, not at sweat, and certainly not at posteriors. They were masters of routine, boiling water in giant copper kettles, stirring it with long sticks, adding soap flakes or soda crystals, and fishing out garments or cloths with tongs. Everything was wrung by hand, twisted against a mangle or slapped on scrubbing boards, then hung on long lines in the garden, flapping like a chorus of very clean secrets. Historians still debate whether these women were fully aware of what they were laundering. But let's be honest, of course they were. The texture, the scent, the occasional stubborn stain, it told its own story. And yet they said nothing. Why? Because discretion wasn't just professional, it was survival. A laundress who gossiped about a mistress's private linens might find herself dismissed. Worse, she might gain a reputation that would bar her from other households. So she worked silently, folding each cloth back into the linen drawer, as if it had never existed. A cycle of wiping, washing, forgetting. Of course, not every household had its own laundress. Many middle-class homes outsourced this work to communal washhouses or took laundry to women who cleaned from their own cottages. These washerwomen were often widows or mothers trying to earn a living, and they accepted all manner of linen, no questions asked. Some developed signature styles, hanging lines in a certain order, using lavender rinse water or wrapping, folded cloths in brown paper tied with twine. Others were brusque and unceremonious. "You wipe it, I scrub it," as one famously said to a nosy house guest. There's even record of laundry codes, a secret shorthand written on tags or scraps of muslin to identify owners or track cycles. The codes varied by town, but they all conveyed one thing: someone wiped and someone else made it clean again. It was an unspoken alliance between women of vastly different worlds. Because Clara, no matter how refined, couldn't very well clean her own cloths without raising eyebrows. To do so would imply she'd touched them, really touched them, and in many social circles that kind of self-sufficiency was viewed as either improper or tragically lower class. So she needed the laundress, and the laundress, in turn, needed Clara. Not for friendship, necessarily, but for the money, the work, and the quiet understanding that passed between glances. A certain sock folded a certain way. A cloth laundered more gently in certain weeks of the month. A discreet supply of extra soap tucked into a basket. They didn't discuss it. They just knew. And for the laundress there was a strange power in this knowledge. In a world where so many women were voiceless, invisible, or dismissed, the laundress was the one who saw everything. She knew which ladies stained more than others, which ones needed cloths replaced too often, which husbands bled on the cuffs, which children had accidents at night. She was, in short, the household's most reliable historian, recording its intimate truths in soap and steam. There's even a theory among social historians that laundresses were the original gossip queens, keepers of information too dangerous to say aloud, but too delicious to ignore. You wanted to stay on her good side, because if anyone knew where the secrets were buried, it was the woman who washed your underwear. Of course, the work was grueling, hours in steam-filled rooms, fingers cracked from lye, heavy pails hauled up. Narrow stairs, burns from the stove, colds from the damp. And no thank yous, just silence. Or maybe a copper penny slipped into a pocket at Christmas. But laundresses held their heads high. They were skilled, respected, if quietly, and indispensable. Some even passed their knowledge down through generations, teaching daughters how to scrub linen with lemon to lift stubborn stains, or how to boil cloths in milk for extra softness. One Lancashire mother reportedly handed her daughter a bundle of wiping cloths at her wedding, freshly laundered and folded with pride. Because if you can't control much in this world, you can at least control how you wipe. You might think Clara never considered all this, that she placed her cloths in the basket and forgot them the moment they disappeared down the corridor. And yes, on the surface, that's exactly what she did. But sometimes, late at night, she wondered who boiled her cloths, who scrubbed them clean, who folded them, warm and fresh, into her drawer beside the lace gloves and sachets. Someone did. Silently, steadily, and with a strength the world rarely noticed. The laundress knows everything, and she tells no one. It's after supper now. You've made your rounds, checked on the parlour fire, offered a polite nod to the vicar's wife, and even smiled during Mr. Tilbury's dull account of his gout. You deserve a moment to yourself, but the house has other plans. As you pass the long hallway toward your room, your ear catches the faint creak of a floorboard, a light footstep, a whisper of cloth brushing against doorframe. You pause. The water closet door clicks shut behind someone. Ah, another soul seeking midnight relief. And this, dear listener, is where the veil lifts a little, where the pristine calm of the Victorian home wavers just enough to let in a bit of wonderfully human chaos, because for all its silences and secrets the house talks, in murmurs, in echoes, in little stories whispered from the water closet. Tonight we slip into those whispered places, not with scandal or salaciousness, but with the same curious grace that allows you to notice someone's glove seams or the fraying edge of a gentleman's collar. Because what happened behind those bathroom doors? Occasionally people wrote it down. Let's begin with the diary of a governess, circa 1862. She writes, delicately, that the third daughter of her employer had an unfortunate misunderstanding, with a jug and a slippery tile, resulting in much commotion, a ruined underskirt, and the mysterious disappearance of the cat. What truly happened is anyone's guess. But the tone? It's clear the young lady slipped, knocked over the chamber pot, and spent the better part of the morning trying to clean it up before the laundress arrived. In another letter, dated 1874, a gentleman writes to his sister about a guest's unfortunate choice to bring her own scented cloths. Apparently, the cloths were perfumed with such strength that the entire guest room smelled like a florist's parlour after a rainstorm. The scent lingered for days, and the maid, presumably less enchanted, referred to it as that choking lavender horror. Historians still debate whether women truly spoke of such incidents among themselves, or whether these diary and letter excerpts were rare outbursts of frankness. Likely, it was both. In a world where one must never say leg, the rare mention of anything toilet adjacent often came wrapped in euphemism, humour, or occasionally poetry. Yes, poetry. One tattered family keepsake, never published but treasured by 4 generations, contains a poem entitled Ode to the Evening Basin. It reads, in part, "Sweet basin near, thy porcelain grace, a solace for my weary face. Yet oft, below thy sister pot, I wish the water were not hot. Make of that what you will." These fragments remind us that Victorian ladies were not unaware of their bodies. They were simply trapped inside a culture that demanded elegance in all things, even the indignities. One young bride, writing to her cousin, admits that she mistook a decorative sugar bowl for the bidet's rinse basin and was too embarrassed to ask for clarification. Her husband, she reports, found the confusion charming, though the tea tray has since been moved. And then there are the servants, often invisible, but not deaf. In a letter from 1888, a scullery maid describes overhearing her mistress mutter, "Blast this corset," after trying and failing to use the chamber pot without removing 3 layers of crinoline. She cursed, the maid writes, like a stable boy in silk. And why not? Sometimes the mess of being alive overrides etiquette. Sometimes the folds of satin and scent can't quite cover the sound of someone losing their balance or swearing under their breath when a rag falls behind the commode. Still, even these moments are rarely shared outright. The language of bodily functions remained, for the most part, politely absent. Instead, Victorians left clues, a note to the laundress requesting a new soap, a line in a journal about a regrettable incident with the puppy and the washstand, a quiet replacement of a cracked chamber pot its floral pattern now slightly askew. But the funniest, perhaps most telling glimpses come from children's writings. One schoolgirl's journal from 1893 includes a crude drawing, hidden between Latin exercises, of her teacher shouting as her hoop skirt knocked over a chamber pot in front of the entire class. "She turned red like tomato," the girl notes, then prayed. Another includes a brief but scathing critique. "Mother's cloths itch. I prefer newspaper, not the Times, that is too crisp." Such lines were rarely meant to survive, but survive they did. They tell us what etiquette books would not, that even in the most polished households, even under chandeliers and beside fainting couches, there were mishaps, improvisations, and giggles muffled by lace. So as you sit now, in your bedroom chair, brushing your hair and contemplating your next carefully folded cloth, know this: you are not alone. Your ancestors laughed behind closed doors. They spilled things, they tripped, they mistook the vinegar rinse for rosewater and wiped with the wrong end of the rag. They were glorious, elegant disasters, just like the rest of us. They didn't write manuals on it, but they lived it. You've earned your place by the fire again, haven't you? After all that folding, boiling, discreet cursing, and whispered bathroom poetry, you deserve a seat, and perhaps a slice of seed cake if the cook's in a generous mood. But tonight's tale doesn't come from the drawing room or the scullery. Tonight we go upstairs, far upstairs, all the way to the palaces where etiquette isn't just a matter of social survival, it's codified, choreographed, and crowned. Because even royalty, as it turns out, must eventually ask the question, what's the proper way to wipe when one wears a tiara? You might think queens and duchesses were spared the indignities of chamber pots, rags, or cracked porcelain. And in some ways, yes, they had more privacy, more attendants, and in rare cases, better plumbing. But convenience, that was relative. Let's begin with Queen Victoria herself. Historians still argue whether her palaces included fully plumbed toilets in the earlier decades of her reign. What we do know is that by 1851 water closets had been installed at Buckingham Palace, but even then they weren't always functional. Pipes froze, drains clogged, and pressure dropped. It was not uncommon for the Queen to default to a chamber pot, often porcelain, ornately painted, and kept in a custom-made cabinet with gold hinges. Naturally. But regardless of how she relieved herself, the Queen, like her subjects, would have needed something to wipe with. So what did she use? One well-preserved note from a lady-in-waiting suggests the royal household ordered delicate cloths prepared from washed muslin and rose oil-infused linen. Whether this was for wiping or post-bideting is not explicitly stated. Victorian letters are famously good at avoiding the point, but the implication is clear: no rough newspaper for Her Majesty. And yet all the elegance in the world couldn't prevent certain mishaps. At a state ball in 1873, the Duchess of Devonshire reportedly fainted, not from poor health, but from embarrassment after a silent attendant entered her dressing room unannounced and caught her mid-wipe. The servant claimed to have seen nothing. The Duchess, allegedly, retired to her country estate for a full month. There's also the tale of Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known for her stunning beauty and famously strict routines. She reportedly travelled with her own set of ablution linens and insisted her chamber pots be emptied within minutes of use, lest the atmosphere interfere with her constitution. She also kept a personal bidet hidden inside what appeared to be an innocent writing desk. Crafty, but not all royal wiping was so composed. One court memoir, published anonymously of course, recounts the ordeal of Princess Louise, Queen Victoria's rebellious daughter, who insisted on using an early flushing toilet during a visit to a cousin in Belgium. The device still experimental, misfired spectacularly and sprayed the princess, her petticoats, and several feet of marble floor. She laughed. No one else did. Because laughter at court was as risky as wiping in silk. Servants, meanwhile, bore the brunt of it all. Royal valets and chambermaids were trained not only in dressmaking and hair arrangement, but in the management of personal linen, a phrase that included everything from menstrual cloths to bidet towels to, yes, wiping rags. These items were counted, tracked, and laundered with military precision. One ledger from Balmoral Castle lists private cloths, Her Majesty, 12 pieces soaked and laundered twice per week, boiled on site. Another includes notes about towel rotation, scent preference, and a mysterious column marked Special, with ticks that scholars have yet to decode. And then there were travel disasters. Imagine being a duchess on a multi-day carriage ride, across muddy roads, trapped in corsets and crinoline, with only a portable commode, a small wooden chest with a chamber pot inside, for relief. The cloths you brought with you had to be stored in sealed bags, rinsed carefully by your lady's maid at roadside inns, and kept hidden from the curious eyes of drivers and porters. One baroness reportedly lost her cloth satchel during such a trip, and had to improvise with torn pages from a diplomatic letter. The letter was never delivered. The incident was never mentioned. Of course, not all aristocrats had these struggles. Some had the luxury of private bathrooms, a rarity but not unheard of. Especially toward the end of the Victorian era, when plumbing improved and indoor fixtures began resembling what we know today. These bathrooms sometimes included washstands, chamber pot cabinets, and yes, even bidet fountains imported from Paris with little fanfare and even less instruction. But whether wiping in Windsor or crouching in Kensington, the rules remained the same. Don't be heard, don't be seen, don't leave any evidence, because if you think your worst fear is someone hearing you in the next stall, imagine being a viscountess knowing that a passing footman might overhear the delicate splash of a porcelain pot and judge you for it. The elegance of royalty, as it turns out, was built on layers of lace, centuries of pretense, and a staggering amount of careful, silent wiping. So tonight, as you slip beneath your quilt and blow out your candle, consider this. Somewhere in the Royal Archives, there's a shelf of ledgers that knows exactly how many cloths Queen Victoria used in 1865. You'll never see them, but they're there, folded, counted, laundered, and forgotten, like all good secrets. The wind is soft tonight. It taps the window panes with quiet insistence, rustling the velvet curtains in Clara's bedroom ever so gently. Somewhere in the distance, a coal carriage rolls past, its wheels clattering on cobbles, but inside all is calm, and you, comfortably tucked in, are about to witness a quiet revolution. Because tonight, history shifts. Slowly, subtly, but unmistakably. Welcome to the changing of the wipe. You see, by the final decades of the 19th century, the world was beginning to modernize in strange, wonderful, and often hilariously awkward ways. Steam trains, electric bells, mechanical butter churns, and yes, eventually, toilet paper. Not the soft, quilted, triple-ply miracle you know today, no. The first commercially available toilet paper in Britain was an experience, let's rewind, just slightly. While the Americans were already producing rolls of medicated paper in the 1850s, the British market remained skeptical. It wasn't until 1880 that the British Perforated Paper Company began producing toilet paper in boxes, sold in individual sheets, neatly stacked, like slightly friendlier playing cards. The product was marketed as medically endorsed, with packaging, that emphasized hygiene, not comfort. Because in true Victorian fashion, it wasn't enough to suggest wiping was practical, you had to make it medicinal. The result? A product so stiff it crackled. If you've ever heard early toilet, paper described as like tracing paper, it's not an exaggeration. It made noise, it resisted folding, it offered the tactile charm of a grocery receipt soaked in talcum powder, and yet people bought it. Slowly, cautiously, and not without complaint. Historians still debate whether it was widely adopted during the Victorian period or only among the wealthier households by the turn of the century. What is certain is that many homes, Clara's included, began to flirt with it. Perhaps a box appears on the corner of her dressing table, or is offered as a gift by a well-meaning cousin who recently read a hygiene tract. Clara opens the box, peers inside, and gently touches the first sheet. It's underwhelming. It's also a little impersonal. Because that was part of the challenge. Cloths could be monogrammed. They could be scented, laundered, folded with love. Newspaper scraps bore the voices of editors, the dates of weddings, the fading news of battles fought. But this new paper? It came from nowhere. It smelled of starch and disapproval. It didn't know you, and yet it was convenient. No soaking, no boiling, no awkward conversations with the laundress. Just wipe, toss, forget. A disposable dream. Of course there were skeptics. One etiquette columnist described the new paper as an industrial insult to the feminine form. Another said it was suitable only for wrapping fish. Still, by the 1890s, more companies entered the market. Rolls began to appear, though slowly, and marketing shifted from the medicinal to the domestic. Ads began to whisper, not shout. Delicate comfort, they promised, for the modern woman. Some even showed a hand reaching for a sheet, as if to say, see? Nothing improper here, just hands. No bottoms in sight. One particularly bold ad from 1898 described their product as a cloud-soft caress for your darkest hour. A bit much, but points for creativity. Clara, curious as ever, begins to experiment. She still uses cloth most days, but on busy mornings she reaches for the crisp square of paper. She folds it twice, then again, like a napkin at a dinner party. She dabs. She assesses. It's not terrible, and more importantly, it's disposable. The impact on servants is immediate. Fewer cloths to wash, fewer secrets to manage, fewer pails to empty. For the laundress, this might be the beginning of liberation, or at least lighter laundry days. But of course, it's never that simple. Old habits linger. Cloth is cheaper in the long run. Many families, even well-off ones, continue using rags well into the 20th century, especially in rural areas where deliveries are slow and chamber pots still reign. Even the bidet persists, occasionally sharing space with the new paper. Some women alternate, paper in the morning, sponge in the evening, a little cloth on holidays. It's a symphony of hygiene, each method taking a solo when the time feels right. But there's no denying it. Change is in the air. You can feel it in the advertisements. You can hear it in the rustle of folded sheets stacked neatly by the pot. You can see it in the quiet satisfaction of a woman who no longer has to boil her own shame every Tuesday, and while Clara may still tuck her cloths into the drawer out of habit, she knows the world is shifting. The old ways are fading. The age of reusable wiping is slowly, silently drawing to a close. She doesn't grieve it. She just smiles, adjusts her bustle, and moves on, because progress isn't always loud. Sometimes it comes folded in a box with perforated edges and a promise of soft, rustling anonymity, and sometimes it comes when you least expect it, with the quiet joy of knowing you'll never again have to explain why your laundry basket smells like lavender and regret. A fog hangs low over the city this morning. It weaves through gas lamps and glides over cobblestones, cloaking London in that soft, smudged watercolor look you've grown to expect from winter. Inside, Clara wraps herself in a shawl, sipping weak, tea by the window. And somewhere in her modest but modernizing townhouse, her thoughts drift to one of the most pressing questions of the day. Is there a right way to wipe? And does everyone do it the same? Because now, on the cusp of a new century, the options are multiplying. Bidets, cloths, paper sheets, scented waters, and with them, a curious new anxiety begins to grow in middle-class parlours and private dressing rooms alike. Welcome to the age of wiping identity. You see, in the Victorian mindset, cleanliness was no longer just about physical health. It had become a moral and national value. And wiping? Wiping was caught up in it. For Britain, empire and hygiene were increasingly tangled. Colonial rhetoric preached that proper sanitation was what distinguished civilized societies from the unclean others, a deeply flawed and racist framework that positioned even something as personal as wiping as a sign of cultural superiority. So when it came to toilet paper, or lack thereof, people began to judge not just what you used, but how you used it and what it said about you. Some households took pride in embracing the new paper, displaying their boxed sheet with modest confidence. Others held tight to cloth, arguing it was more refined, more reusable, more English. Bidets were still whispered about, labelled foreign or too intimate. And in rare cases, a house might contain all three options, creating something of a sanitary melting pot, if not a logistical nightmare. Historians still argue whether toilet habits were truly class-based by this time, or if regional differences played a greater role. Some suggest that the real divide wasn't rich versus poor, but urban versus rural. In cities like London, with access to chemists, delivery routes, and the Times advertising toilet products on page 9, modern options were accessible. In the countryside, not so much. A bucket of moss still served just fine in Dorset, and no one minded. Still, etiquette books began to include thinly veiled references to personal hygiene, never directly, of course, but through coded advice. One manual published in 1899 advised young ladies to maintain daily freshness, recommending clean linens at all levels and suggesting the timely disposal of unnecessary rags. Another encouraged women to be ever mindful of the unseen corners of self, which sounds vaguely like a ghost story, but was meant as a polite nod to undercarriage maintenance. More than ever, wiping became a mark of domestic competence. If your guest water closet contained a fresh pitcher, a scented hand towel, and a discreet receptacle for waste paper, you were considered a gracious host. If it didn't, well, you might not be invited to the vicar's tea again. Ladies' magazines chimed in, too, articles with titles like For the Modern Miss, Your Morning Regimen, and Secrets of a Proper Boudoir offered laundry lists of what a well-prepared lady should keep in her dressing area, often nestled between face powder and hairpins. Soft cloth or disposable paper, folded and perfumed, but not everyone was on board. The traditionalists sniffed at the change. One indignant letter to the Ladies' Monthly Journal railed against this creeping tide of papery vulgarity, and lamented the loss of good English flannel, boiled and dried as our mothers taught us. There's even mention of a ladies' group, the Guild of Modest Habits, that swore off toilet paper entirely in favour of traditional methods and morning hymns. The hymns were optional. Meanwhile, manufacturers saw opportunity. Toilet paper advertising took a strange, almost poetic turn, emphasising purity, safety, and national pride. A clean Britain is a strong Britain, one slogan proclaimed. Another boasted, "Used in Her Majesty's naval stations," which may have made sailors roll their eyes, but certainly made middle-class housewives take notice. And somewhere, amid all this marketing, judgment, and newfound awareness, Clara found herself torn. She liked the paper sheets in a way. The convenience, the privacy, the toss-and-forget aspect. But she still kept her cloths for special days, for when she felt delicate, for when the paper, let's face it, felt like sandpaper dipped in starch. She wasn't alone. Most women didn't transition all at once. They used paper some days, cloth others, and, in a pinch, the corner of the Bristol Gazette. A survey taken just after the turn of the century found that only a small fraction of homes had fully converted to paper. The rest were transitional, or what one historian dubbed hybrid wipers. Even among servants, opinion was split. Some maids embraced the new ways. It meant less laundry, fewer awkward moments at the washtub. Others complained that guests didn't know how to dispose of used paper properly, leading to mysterious bundles tucked behind washstands or left floating in chamber pots like guilty paper boats. To combat this, some households introduced waste, paper bins lined with ash or sawdust. Others encouraged flushing, though Victorian plumbing was still too inconsistent to trust entirely. One London widow allegedly hung a sign in her water closet that read, "One sheet at a time, dear. Remember, the pipes." And then, of course, came the ultimate expression of identity, the embroidered toilet paper cover. Yes. As paper rolls gained popularity in the very last years of the 19th century, some clever needleworkers began crafting lace and crochet covers, like doilies with ambition to disguise the offending object, because if you're going to embrace modernity, you might as well do it with style. Clara bought one. Ivory lace with tiny blue ribbons. She didn't really need it, but it made her feel adaptable. The world was changing, and so was she, one square at a time. It's evening now, proper evening, the kind where lamplight turns warm and golden, and every creak of the floorboards sounds like a whisper from the past. The coals in the fireplace have settled into a deep, pulsing red, and outside the window, the fog has thickened like milk. You've been with Clara a long while. You've watched her fold flannel cloths with practiced care, balance herself over porcelain bowls in the half-light, and adopt new technologies with equal parts skepticism and grace. And now, as the century draws to a close, she, like the rest of the world, begins to say goodbye. Goodbye to the lace-draped pot beneath the bed. Goodbye to boiling cloth in copper kettles. Goodbye even to the silent system of signals between lady and laundress, because the modern age is knocking. It begins not with fanfare, but with plumbing. Indoor water closets, once a novelty reserved for the wealthy or the daring, are becoming standard in new middle-class homes. They come with tiled floors, small wash basins, and, glory of glories, a pipe that whisks everything away with a single pull of a brass chain. And with that comes the final, perhaps most permanent, change. Toilet paper on a roll. No more folded squares in boxes. No more scratching and crinkling. By the very early 1900s, soft roll paper becomes available, still rough by today's standards, but positively luxurious compared to the alternatives. Clara, now a woman of a certain age, eyes it with cautious optimism. She still keeps her clothy drawer. Old habits die slowly, and besides, there's a kind of comfort in what's familiar. But the roll is there now too, hanging from a little iron bracket, a frill of paper peeking out like the lace edge of a petticoat. She's not alone in this dual existence. Across England, Homes straddle the line between then and now. Privies in the backyard, but paper rolls. In the guest chamber, cloths in the cupboard, but a porcelain pull-chain toilet humming quietly in the corner. There are still holdouts, of course. Old aunts who refuse the paper, claiming it feels untrustworthy. Servants who warn that flushing too often will upset the pipes. And printed handbills warning of the wasting of paper and national decline. Because even wiping has politics, it seems. Historians still argue whether this final shift was cultural or technological. Did people adopt toilet paper because they believed in its hygienic superiority or because the infrastructure finally allowed it? Did it arrive as a triumph of progress or simply a matter of convenience? Maybe both, but what matters in the end is that something fundamental has changed. No longer is wiping a whispered ritual passed down in secrecy. It's a public commodity, sold in chemist shops, advertised in magazines, and stocked in train, stations and hotels. It's something spoken of, however delicately, in polite conversation. A letter from a middle-class woman in 1901 mentions buying 2 rolls of the good paper, along with tea and bread, as casually as you'd list sugar and thread. Another recounts how her youngest daughter used half a roll just to watch it spin. A timeless joy. And so the final transition is underway. Clara still has her ways. She still prefers warm water for certain days, a soft cloth when she's feeling tender, and a bit of rose oil when she's under the weather. But she's no longer afraid to keep a roll by the basin. She no longer worries what the maid will think. She no longer feels like her body's quiet routines must stay invisible. She has lived through an era where wiping went from invisible to industrial, from sacred to sanitary, and somehow still held its peculiar dignity. And now, as she snuffs her lamp and slips between the sheets, she leaves behind a world that has learned, at long last, to be just a little more honest about what happens behind closed doors. Not crude at all, just honest, and that is the most Victorian part of all. Dignity not in denial, but in discretion. So next time you reach for a roll or toss a sheet without thinking, or chuckle at the awkward charm of lace-covered chamber pots, remember Clara. Remember every woman who folded, washed, boiled, rinsed, sniffed, winced, and kept going. Without applause, without complaint, just clean, quiet perseverance. Because history isn't made only in parlors and ballrooms. Sometimes it's made in the water closet, so now the room is quiet. The fire has faded to embers. The house no longer creaks. Even the fog seems to have curled up and gone to sleep along the garden walls. You rest now, not just as Clara, but as someone who's peeked behind the velvet curtain of daily life in another time, a life filled with whispers, with ritual, with private routines that were never written in textbooks, but were no less real. Perhaps even more so. You've traced every step from moss to muslin, sponge to sheet, chamber pot to paper roll. You've seen the quiet revolutions of women who made do, who innovated, who never got credit for the systems they upheld. And as you drift towards sleep, you carry with you not just facts or oddities, but a soft, strange appreciation for the mundane, for the overlooked, for the quiet labor that stitches history together, one folded cloth at a time. No one wrote epic poems about wiping, but maybe they should have. For now, let the past wrap around you like a warm quilt. Let the distant clatter of wash basins and the hush of starching hands fade into softness. You're safe, you're clean, you're home, your sweet dreams.